I thought interestingly from the social constructionist perspective, I was thinking about your writings on gender differences and sex differences. And I sort of thought, well, these are biological, but are they immutable to change? So I would think about gender differences possibly like height, like the genes for height, meaning that if you put enough selective environmental pressures on them,
sure, you
can change the height. Whereas the gene that allows limb bud differentiation, Sonic Hedgehog, is impermeable. I would think of as impermeable. It takes a very, very acute toxin like thalidomide to affect it. And I wondered whether gender differences like that, because I think you can see society changing. And you use Sweden as the example, but I would use places like, movements like the Kurdish Liberation Army, the Peshmerga in Iran, and say, these are movements now that have 50% female fighters on the front line that are going up against ISIS. They're effective. But of course, that's a very specific culture. They take Marxist principles when they form their militias. And combat has changed.
Right.
So combat in the 20th and 21st century has changed. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually, just in two of my, I'm teaching 2 courses this semester, and in both of them, this general issue came up, and under the guise of how long does a trait take to, evolve in a particular evolutionary trajectory? And my answer was, because so what happens when students are first exposed to evolutionary psychology, they'll say, yeah, but what you're talking about is no longer relevant today. So shouldn't we evolve away from that? So it's, in a sense, it's speaking to your point, right? Should these particular sex differences that you've written about, go ahead.
That you can create so much, you can potentially, let's say through quotas and through all sorts of societal pressures. I mean, you can see it, different societies in India. So you use the example of James Damore's memo in Google, but India has a 34% of its IT population female.
Right.
And so you can see that cultures and selective, deliberate pressure could change things that were even biological.
Well, yes and no. It depends what you're saying. So, for example, if you're saying, how many the Peshmerga, how many female fighters there are, I mean, that's just an outcome-based reality, right? So we can change the cultural tradition so that a particular role that women were, quote, not allowed to engage in, they now can. But that's not really where, the selection pressures that I talk about in my, research on sex differences come from. So here's one that will be impervious to change unless you had, many, many, many years of selection pressures. The fact that women are attracted to ambitious, highly driven, status-seeking males is not going to change. So whether we have more people in IT in India or less, or we have more people driving in Saudi Arabia or not, is completely irrelevant to the fundamental sex-specific difference when it comes to human mating, right? So as a matter of fact, in women who are very, very successful even insist more on a man being high status. So the rate at which an adaptation takes before it becomes, part of our, manifestation of our human nature depends, right? So for example, the fact that I have 10 fingers is now a fixed trait. So it's not, it's not a normal distribution. Some of us are not born with 6, some of us are born with 12, right? It's 10. So for us to move away from that will undoubtedly take hundreds of thousands or millions of years of a particular selection pressure. Like the mole rat that lives underground has now evolved away its visual system. It can't see. So on the other hand, there are some traits, human traits, that evolve very quickly in the order of several hundred years, if not thousands of years. So for example, the fact that some societies have individuals with a greater propensity for lactose intolerance, that happens very, very quickly. So cultures that have pastoral living as a cultural tradition end up having lower rates of lactose intolerance. Those cultures that don't have a traditional pastoral living have higher rates. That doesn't take long. It takes in the order of, a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand years. So depending on the trait, it will depend how long we can select. So my feeling is, again, it depends which sex difference you're talking about, but the most fundamental sex differences that define our differences are not really purview to environmental changes within the lifetime of an individual human being. Does that make sense? Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking of an example. I can't remember the name of the village or the small region, but there's a place, I think, in China where it is a purely matriarchal society. So women own everything, run everything. And so they're the heads of families. They're incredibly ambitious. It's interesting that the men are all listless and are not monogamous either. So in that case, you have women who have no choice but to be attracted to men who aren't ambitious.
So I don't know about that particular context. I'd have to look into it.
I'll have to look it up. Yeah.
Yeah. But that example, by the way, Mark, actually proves an important evolutionary point, and that comes from behavioral ecology. And it's as follows. There are some things where, the human universals are really quite ubiquitous. But the reality is that for many phenomena, we've evolved adaptability as an adaptation. Now that's, if I may say, that's actually a really profound point that people might miss. So let me just expand on it. The immune system has evolved to have degrees of freedom. So for example, if the immune system had only evolved to solve 3 specific pathogens, P1, P2, P3, then we'd all be dead long ago, because pathogens mutate very quickly. So as soon as we go from P1 to P1 star, if the immune system cannot have the plasticity to on the fly deal with a new pathogen, we'd all be dead. The same logic applies for human behavior. Humans have evolved the capacity to be plastic in their behavior. That's exactly what the field of behavioral ecology is all about. Behavioral ecologists study cross-cultural differences as adaptive responses. You're with me? Yes. So therefore, while most cultures practice polygyny as a mating system, meaning one man, multiple women, about 85% of documented cultures are at least allow for the possibility of polygyny. All other cultures are monogamous, and there are very, very rare cases of polyandrous societies. Polyandrous societies, the most famous of which is Tibetan polyandry, is where one woman is shared by multiple men. Now, an imbecile who doesn't understand evolutionary theory says, aha, well, that invalidates evolutionary theory. But once you realize that there are very clear evolutionary reasons why the human capacity to change can be channeled this way or that way, depending on varying ecosystems, then you realize that those cultural differences are themselves due to biology. So without knowing anything else about the Chinese example you gave, I can guarantee you right here with complete swagger and assuredness that there is an evolutionary reason for that reality.
Selection pressures.
Indeed.